Our program today is sort of, let's see what you know as well as what we know. And David Stewart has agreed to help me kind of corral things, but we want to hear from you. And we know that everybody has different situations. You get a phone call, transmitter is not running right. A 3 kilowatt FM is putting out 105 watts. And you ask them what's going on. Oh, we have a fault marker here on the exciter. And you walk them through that, and that disappears. And now the transmitter is down to 100 watts. Well, press the raise button. Oh, no, I have to go to remote. I'll check on it tomorrow. And of course, now you're really kind of figuring what they're doing. Power went out and they're operating at low power. So there's two things that come to mind, aren't there? The first thing is that some button got stuck somewhere or somebody was playing games. If it's an AM, you may have a cutback in the middle of a storm. But here's something that I'll bet some of you run into, some of you may need to do, and that is change the battery in your transmitter. Because after a while, the battery that holds the settings up in CMOS runs down. And when the power goes out, there go your settings. So it seems some manufacturers recommend changing that battery every year. I've seen it last longer than a year, but it's certainly the first thing that comes to mind. And that's the whole idea of what we want to talk about today is when you get a troubled call, where do you go first? Do you go to the studio first? Do you go to the transmitter first? Depends on the call, doesn't it? Depends on whether it's an automatic transmitter issue, whether it's your programming. Native American station not far from here was throwing dead air for 2 days. Turned out to be a bad network card. Over the weekend, the IT department didn't feel necessary to react to it until Monday. So would you go to the transmitter because they reported they were off the air? Well, they weren't really off the air. So the first thing you ask them is, do you have a carrier? Otherwise, you waste hours sometimes going out to the transmitter site. And so that's the sort of thing we want to talk about is when the call comes in, and it may be a live person, or it may be that you have your automated system from the remote control, which will send you an email or a text to say that something is not right. What's the first thing to check? David?
Back when we had staff, the first question to ask of the all-night call is, if your name is Mario, which Mario? Because I've started conversations with A and realized about 5 minutes later when I was wide awake, I'm thinking of the wrong guy and giving him the wrong directions. He'd be describing a remote control with buttons, and I'm thinking, no, that station doesn't have, no one broke in and installed that remote control. And a lot of it was just fighting the overnight call. Like I said, get into focus, and sometimes don't be in a huge hurry.
That's the key point, isn't it? Once the station's programming is interrupted, whether it's orally only or the carrier, getting back on the air 10 seconds sooner isn't going to make much of a difference.
Yeah, the break is the habit is broken. They'll be back in an hour, a day, sometime. Maybe you can make it good. Probably you can make it good. Our benchmark used to be Super Bowls. If you're off the air and it's Super Bowl Sunday and it happens to be the last day of the broadcast calendar in the last year your company has rights to the Super Bowl, you can't make that good. Almost everything else you can catch up. No matter what the sales manager tells you, we can probably wedge it in someplace. But yeah, it's first, I just say be calm, and none of this is news. If I can do this, anybody can do this. But it's act methodically Easiest way to be calm and act methodically is to have planned a little bit. If you've seen the site, if you've worked on the equipment, if you've read any of the books, you're in a good position. If it's a station that maybe you've taken on, but you've not had time to research it, a lot of it depends on who makes the call. Nowadays, tends to be owners or ops managers. There aren't, everyone that is left has some real say. And if they call, it's like, okay, a grown-up has called. This is a good start. And you try and find.
Well, you would think so. Sales manager calling you. Of course, some of the companies, Continental mentioned to me some couple of years ago that they really had, first of all, cut down any kind of tech support after hours. And secondly, if they discovered it was a sales manager or something like that, they would refrain from helping them do much in the transmitter liability wise.
That seems very reasonable. You have a lot of people who want to be hands-on, want to be problem solvers, and some get good at it and some never do. So you have to establish, are they a danger to themselves or to others? And the Continental deal, and they recently, with a couple of retirements, the only tech people they have are the ones fulfilling government contracts. They can read the FM notes, the AM notes, as well as anyone you could get on the phone. But it's not like when we had Ken Branton or Dave Chenoweth, and they could tell you walking into the building what it was.
Yeah. Yeah. But now, okay, first of all, depends where you're located, doesn't it? Because you could turn a radio on and see if there's a carrier there. If you're out of the market or if you're in one of those predictable directional minima, it might be a little more difficult. But you want to start, you want to know, and with so many stations being unattended these days, when there's a trouble call, it generally falls upon the tech guy to find out where to start. And I think one of the first places, just make sure your transmitter is on the air if you're coming from a location. If you can hear it, or if you can dial it up on a remote, that I think would be number one.
Yeah, do the readings seem normal in any way? Has the transmitter folded back because the antenna is iced up? Has how much of normal do you have when you start? And hopefully you have silent sensors or listen lines or whatever. Many little stations, when they stream the audio, you'll see them come off of tuners somewhere at the studio. So if you check the stream, okay, it's a tuner that's feeding the encoder. It's a tacky way to go, but it's remarkable how common that is.
Yeah, quite true. I've seen that several times, and of course, at the same time, you want to have some indication that there is a signal at the studio. There was one station from a major consolidator. I won't mention it. They put a transmitter at a site which I told them was not a good site, and well, let's put it this way: the transmitter went off the air, and they didn't know about it for almost a week. I've heard other stations where typically you wouldn't think this would happen, but another consolidator that I was doing standby for, one day I got a call around 10 o'clock in the morning. Seems that somebody had run into a power vault and a particular audio processor on a particular HD enabled radio station didn't come back up. So it threw dead air from about 3:30 until about 9:45 in the morning, when somebody called the station and said, "Are you guys coming on today?" And it developed that not one employee of that radio station listened to the station that entire morning. Not the operator, not the sales manager, not the program director, nobody, not even a receptionist. They didn't even know they were off the air for 6 hours.
And this was one of the multicast that was off?
This was the whole station. They were throwing dead air, actually, is what it was.
Yeah, I've had the multicast go silent, and it's true. Maybe no one loves that station, or it's you always ask who is responsible, not in a blame sense, but I mean, whose job is it to check this? And there are a lot of people who can tell you, no, it is not me, because all these things that get added. I imagine this happens in television. That, okay, yeah, we have an encoder that has 10 streams going through it. And does anyone ever look at it? I have a friend in LA who just marvels at all the various multicasts. And when one of them is minus sound or something, he'll call me and just describe the weirdness that can result. And I just wonder, the rack to do it is not real complex or real big, but I'm thinking enough monitors to watch it and send notes might be.
Yeah.
So detecting silence automatically seems simple enough. Is there any equipment out there that will compare the audio that's supposed to be there to what's actually there and give you an alert on that?
The problem is this, in this particular case, and it's a few years ago now, the problem was that their air signal was not popular with their operator. So he would listen to the program line. The Silent Sense, which was not particularly working properly, was running off of Modulation Science's mod monitor, which with an HD radio has a minimum modulation of 28% or thereabouts. Therefore, the Silent Sense never kicked in because, as far as it was concerned, there was modulation on the station. And it again boiled down to not one staffer bothered to check their own station through the morning.
I think
That might also be a management problem where someone should be responsible for checking their meter readings and also listening to make sure there's program content.
Yeah.
At
Yep.
Radio Disney, there was absolutely nobody's job to listen to the station. My favorite little oops was this had to do with a problem with Marketron, the automation, and daylight savings time. Those three things came together one week, and the automation didn't get the proper log update or didn't get the correct transition. I forget exactly what it was. So it kept playing Sunday's log. When it ran out of Sunday, it started playing Sunday again. It was 3 days before anybody realized that the same commercial log for Sunday had been playing for 3 days into the week. That's a little more subtle problem, I'll admit, but it's indicative of the fact that nobody at the station was being paid to listen to the station.
I have an interesting story along that line.
Please.
There's a tower on the southwest side of Boston in a place called Needham called FM 128. It has no television on it. It's all FM radio stations and ancillary type antennas. It was managed by, at that time, American Tower, and there was a power generator for the entire site. On a Friday afternoon, a big storm came through, and one of the cutouts on the three-phase power feed from the utility company popped. The generator started, and nobody was paying attention. Saturday afternoon, when the fuel for the generator ran out, and all those big FM radio stations and the translators and the microwave links all went silent at once. It took troubleshooting, a way to think. And one of the first things you do when you have a multi-user site is check to see if any of the other users are on. And I did that and found 2 others off. And then I called those people and let them know. It took like a couple of hours to get there. And the power company had to repair it because since it wasn't reported to them on Friday, they didn't know it had happened. So the power hadn't been fixed yet. So it was a real zoo to get that thing back on the air. So troubleshooting in these kinds of situations requires a blank slate, completely open mind.
We did that with a mountaintop site where the power for the whole mountaintop would go down. So you check, is the TV station there? Is anybody else there, et cetera. So same thing.
Here we had a very similar station where it had a 2-hop STL, and the station dropped off orally. And so the first thing I did was tune up the site where it was actually a television channel where the drop came, and found that was off. Called their engineer, and he upbraided me because I was bothering him during his Sunday breakfast. And oh, if we were off the air, our master control would call me. I said, you're off the air because I have no audio on my transmitter. Well, whenever we figure this out, we'll take care of it. Turns out that a few minutes after I called him, so did master control, and he drove up the mountain at breakneck speed to find out that the generator had overcranked, and basically he had to fix it and get things back going. But as Grady was saying, you need to know the whole RF chain, just as you need to know the whole audio chain to diagnose where the problem is. And that's that story. I'll just pause for a second here and mention, if you would like to be heard, please feel free to put your hand up. There's a little thing in the bottom here. It says raise hand, and then we can call you in a break or let you in a little more easily if you have a problem jumping in.
Chris Alexander posted a note about the various delays in the air chains, and he has silent sensors all along the chain. But he also mentioned that your silent sensor can be fooled by the CD player going na 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 na, because audio is audio. The at Broadcast Tools, from the smart silent sensor forward, they would catch snow if you had dead air and static, or repeating bits. Was pretty good about catching that. But it's one of the things you have to look at. Had an AM that was the only station at a site, and it had a very big generator. One afternoon, rainy day, it went off the air. It was not, it was not our favorite child, so we didn't hurry. But you get out there, and it's like everyone's described. You're looking at a site where there is no power. There are no they're little bitty short towers, but a couple of them were lit. There are no tower lights. Nothing is working. And the first thing you think is not, it ran on the generator for half a week, and then when it ran out of fuel, it stopped. It went to the generator during a power failure, and for some reason did not come back.
Oh, that reminds me of the San Francisco experience, where they had that big earthquake and the power outage, and one of the big 50s cranked up its generator and got back on the air for 1 hour. The makeup tank pump ran on city power. That goes to installation issues and watching what you're doing when you come to work for a station, because you cannot make assumptions. About 20 years ago, again, at one of the big consolidators, I was working in the control room, or the rec room, and I discovered in the afternoon, about 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, for some reason, the station started drifting above 105%. And so, being the good guy that I am, I went over to the rack, brought the remote control up to power raise lower trim, press lower, and the station promptly went off the air. Well, I went over to plate raise, and it did come back, and I was relieved, but I was a little concerned because they could trim from 106% to 0. In the end, my mission was to go up to the transmitter and look through the wiring. And I went to the remote control, and I went to the transmitter, and I looked at the book, and I discovered that channel 4 lower, the power trim, was connected to filaments off. It had been that way for at least 5 years before I turned up. But once I fixed that and fixed the other pair that went to automatic power control, transmitter never had a problem again. Not that problem, anyway.
I've seen sites where the power trim up and power trim down were reversed. And you see what you think you're going to see. If you push the lever and it says up, you expect the reading to go up. And if you're only going a few percent, you start wondering, is the line voltage wobbling enough to counteract this? If you see it drop 40%, it's like, okay, I've pegged it high while I was hitting lower. It's like, okay, now you begin to suspect, but it is not the first impulse you have. I had two notes here. These can be transmitters, but very often these are studios. Thing that's changed is utilities. If it's your fuel, if it's your electrical, you need not just the account numbers, you need whatever address the utility thinks you have. And they usually, nowadays, they need passwords and pins and whatnot. We have become so secure about not sharing personal information that most utilities will not talk to you unless you are exactly the registered person. And most people aren't aware of this when they set up the account, so they don't write it down. The other one is you get kind of a similar deal on software. If your automation stops and it has stopped because you haven't bought some upgrade, your manager, your owner didn't pay for this. And suddenly I'm like, I don't know if that's a technical problem. I am not very smart problem. And it may not be mine. I get that enough, but you have moments where I need to have a very diplomatic conversation with someone about, gee, these things need to be paid.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've kind of forked here a little bit, haven't we? I just brought up this idea of coming to a station and you're brand new at that station, or you've inherited a facility as opposed to just merely reacting to a trouble call. So again, let's talk for just a few moments, if some of you would like to. When you come to a new facility, you may not be working for the same station for 40 years, but you come to a facility that you haven't worked at before. What would be your first thing to check? Where would you start? Would it be the transmitter? Would it be the studio? Where would you start in checking out the facility you're working for?
Breaker boxes. And particularly if you're buying a station, if it has been silent, and you get these now and then, trace it while there aren't people in the building and there aren't people trying to use it. You have a window of opportunity when you can trace breakers during the day. I remember we took over a station and I was, in a few days we were on the air, and I discovered that on 3 floors, things right above each other, below each other, would be tied to the same breaker. This included a kind of penthouse control room, some of its outlets, the coffee pot near the break area on the ground floor, and some other junk in the basement. Because the quickest way to run it was just up or down through the floors, through the ceiling, what had been the ceiling. So if things are labeled and they look professionally installed, that's a great thing. Worked in a station about a month ago. It had super well documented stuff. Everything was neatly typed, they'd done it on a word processor, but it was all dated 1988. Not this was a transmitter site, so not a lot had changed, but I was there to to install a new transmitter.
So one of the things that really is important is check to make sure you have licenses that are available to see. Make sure you have the proper documentation for the equipment. This is always a problem when you go into a building and there's a transmitter there and there's no manual, there's no computer, there's no nothing. And you want to figure out how can you work on that piece of equipment.
And as transmitter models changed, the Continentals would come, like the 816 probably came in 24 versions, and they would be power levels, but there was ABC. Mm-hmm. Just in the run, if you had 100 of these transmitters, said, yeah, the first 70 were this way, 71 through 83 were this way, and then 84 up were some other way. And these would include things like was it mounted on a back panel or on a shelf somewhere inside? And someone getting a different version book could be, that would really gum up troubleshooting.
One of my very first jobs as CE, way back in the dim, dark mists of history, I had a Gates Harris FM5K 7.5. Anyway, it went down one day, and being brand new, I pulled out the book and I was looking through it and didn't make a whole lot of sense. So I called the tech support line and got a guy. He pulled his book out, discovered neither of our manuals matched the transmitter. So we kind of reasoned our way through it and fixed it. But yeah, TFT was very famous for having many different manuals depending upon your serial number.
And for a lot of the, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, when I've walked into a new place, I start at the transmitter and work my way back to the studio and draw my own diagram of what I see. And then later, if I find documentation, that gives me a guide to see if the existing documentation matches what I saw, or what. You can kind of get a feel for, what they got in their manual agrees with my sketch or not. Then you kind of got a level of trust you can have. And you also find later little things. I like to go through and find out how to make the site safe about the third day I'm there. Take it off the air, take my voltmeter. How do you turn this thing off? Completely off. Find that out in the daytime, not at 2 a.m. when you're short on coffee.
There was a transmitter somewhere that Rod Ziegler wrote about for me some years back, where he discovered that the transmitter and the exciter were fed from 2 different power sources. And
I've seen that.
You got one breaker turned off and there's still power in there, and your fingers can get singed pretty quickly.
Another trick on the Continentals, while I'm just thinking about it, an IEC computer plug, there is no standard. Those can be 220. And in fact, the default wiring on an 816, some variation, is 220. If you plug it into an exciter strap for 110, you may have a little trouble. Not that I would know that from all the smoke that came out. But,
Well, I didn't have the 816, but I did the 316, the AM, the 10 kilowatt AM. And the thing I found most frequently with that transmitter was interlocks. The interlocks would get dirty. So you would have to check through to make sure that all the interlocks were closed. And sometimes that old story about the guy that walked around the transmitter twice and then kicked it in the little spot, transmitter comes up, he sends in the bill for $1,500, 50 cents for my time, $1,495 for knowing where to smack.
Yeah.
On that thing with separate circuit breakers, a lot of AMs used to have a separate breaker for the crystal heater. So you'd be digging around in there and it was still hot.
That's true. That's true. And when the breakers come from different breaker boxes in different areas. So it's what Mark was talking about. It's really beneficial when you start with a particular facility to have yourself a graphic description, a line, just where it's going, what's connected to what, knee bone connected to the thigh bone sort of thing. And then check to see if you have all the right manuals, to see if you have the updates. I know in times when we've had Jeff Welton on, and he'll be back with us again next month, he talks about going out to radio stations and all the manufacturer updates are sitting neatly in a little box, never installed. Part of the problem, the past couple of weeks, we've heard all these breathless things about watch your EAS box to make sure it's updated. It was a hacker at DEF CON using an old box that was 3 or 4 versions of hard software firmware back. If you have a DASDEC, for instance, and you have 4.1 or 4.4, you don't have a problem. It isn't going to bother you. But if you're still running on 2. something or 3. something, you should know it because you're not getting the iPause CAP messages anyway. And yes, there are stations out there that are running old EAS boxes, and some of them running boxes that are, connected to the internet when they shouldn't be.
On circuit breakers, it'd probably be good on the transmitter itself And also on each associated rack to have a label saying which circuit breaker controls what, so you don't have to go guessing.
Well, that takes a little time and a little labeling, and some techs think that that's job security, to have obscurity of where things are and what they do and how they do it, which is always an issue. David, you've gone through so many transmitters in the different stations, especially when you were head there at Univision Radio. Did you find any common thread to the folks that you had working in the field that they didn't check, and would come up and you would say, why didn't you check that?
We had built our group recently, and we had done it from lots of different places. We didn't have a lot of common systems. We didn't even have uniform studio systems, because if our thought was, if the PD was getting good ratings and the staff knew how to work it, it wasn't my job to make everyone's life miserable pushing a common system. But of course, it's what monster companies do. And when you start needing to swap files to voice track, and I was still working in an age where they said the Spanish radio is unique to each town because the makeup of your community was unique to each town. Probably the thing that got the least attention were backup systems. When most of the stations, the higher the ratings, the better equipped were, better backed up. We had stations that 1 minute of unscheduled downtime would probably call for some resignations because it just nearly couldn't happen. We had other stations where you have one of everything, and honestly, if it goes off the air, make a note, and before 10 days is out, we should do something. But those were often pieces of upgrade puzzles where we were moving stations around. They need to be on, they need to sound good, we want them legal, but no one loved those stations. But generators, at one point we had 4 sites where their only power came from diesel generators, and we were saying we were going to mechanic school. Drips and spills didn't get enough attention, and once it was part of Univision, nothing was more important than the environmental state of things. They were very concerned, and the previous deal, we didn't want to make a mess, but we went back far enough that I'd had old timers say, yeah, you want to edge around your AM transmitter, use crankcase oil to kill the weeds. And you start having people saying, yeah, we're going to need, level 1, stage 1 type environmental surveys everywhere. And you're like, yeah, listen, we were finding, World War II surplus weed killer that, I don't really want to be testifying about this in court someday, but it was backup systems getting attention and the generators getting attention were really the big one. On the transmitters, we had fairly recent equipment, and even the tube equipment, what we also had was very good engineering managers. We just had chiefs who knew what they were doing, and we still had staffs. A lot of that has gotten trimmed over the years.
Grady?
To David's earlier point in his most recent talking there, it's great to have shelf spares. But one of the things that happens these days is we're also busy because we're also understaffed and overworked, that you'll proudly go and take your on-the-shelf spare to a transmitter site and get them back on the air quickly. But then you put the spare that you just took out that doesn't work on a shelf. And it goes out of your mind, and there's nobody else watching it. And that thing sits there for 6 months until you need one of those again. And then you don't have it. It takes a special attention with your spare equipment to make sure that when you use it, you can fix the stuff so you can reuse it. That's all.
You may
I
have
had a station that had dutifully saved all their blown fuses. Also, when buying a replacement part, I buy 2. I mean, if it failed once, get it on the shelf.
Mike Shane?
Mute there. Okay. I had a thing I did with tubes. And granted, we had more tubes at the plant than most folks probably, but I had a card file and a card for each tube with its serial number on it. So if ever I took a tube out and was going to put it on the shelf because I didn't know if it was really dead yet or not, I would note that in the cards for both the tube I took out and the tube I put in before getting out of the building.
I remember seeing that back in radio stations in the 60s. And by the 80s, they were almost no longer existing. And of course, raises the issue here of auxiliary transmitters that David mentioned. I'd like to, first of all, comment that auxiliary transmitters used to be much more critical because solid state runs much more reliably. But the other problem is space, isn't it? There are a lot of mountain sites where you're paying by the square foot, and the station has this mentality of reducing their rent. And if any of you have some experience with that, I'd appreciate that. I don't want to put you on the spot instantly, but Chris, you have a whole bunch of folks there at Crawford in different places, and maybe give you a minute to think about it and tell us what your philosophy is about auxiliary transmitters. And Mark, will call you first.
All right, I was just going to speak up on the subject of tubes. Did you see this is the 75th anniversary of the invention of the transistor? If you've ever been to Homedale, New Jersey, the water tower there looks like an old transistor on purpose. It's also to be noted that what was it, on Sirius XM or something on 60s, they're saying, remember when you listen to a transistor, you remember the good old days? Well, lo and behold, did you know, in an iPhone 14, there are 16 billion transistors, and its day is not done. I just thought I'd raise my hand on that. It's all still transistor radios.
We all lived through the transition from tubes through the transistors, which would distort once you get above +1 on the meter. Those were the germanium ones there in the Gates President series.
On all the series, I had a Gates Executive that was all germanium, and I loved it. You could also stand on the pots.
Yeah, but you had to make sure that the announcer talent couldn't smack the meter to the right side because you'd go into
a lot of the guts got replaced. Andy Laird used to keep the frame and the pots, build external amplifiers, and he called the whole executive the pot holder. But as we started doing, as we went solid state, we had to advance measurement technology. That the early amplifiers had good THD numbers, they had lousy IMD numbers, and we just weren't looking in the right places. People said, this amp should sound better than it does. And it turned out, we need to measure a little more smartly.
I love the fact people want the old tube type guitar amplifiers and stuff because of the soft sound, and solid state just won't cut it. But lo and behold, the first thing they stick on that's a fuzz box.
Yeah.
The filters between the ears.
Okay. So what's your philosophy about auxiliary transmitters? Anyone? I know I kind of tossed it in Chris's direction, almost like a grenade, but
I'm here. You hearing me okay?
Yeah, I do. Thank you.
Okay. Well, things have really, as Dave mentioned a minute ago, things have really changed over the last decades, with transmitters in general, as we've made the transition from tube type to solid state. And you'd see a lot of facilities around that had a nice new solid state main transmitter, and this tube type auxiliary over there that's may or may not ever get tested. And when it does get tested, it may not work because its PA is ducted to the outside world. And so, you get all kinds of condensation and stuff in there, and nobody really pays attention to it. my philosophy is, why even have one if you're not going to take care of it? And then you've really got to take some extraordinary measures, I think, if you're going to keep an old tube type aux running. And that may mean a lot of mechanical work to shut those things off from the outside world. It's not difficult to, in the summertime, you've got this nice air conditioned ductwork in there, and then it's vented to the outside. So you got, depending on where you are, warm, humid air entering it. And there's your recipe for disaster. In the wintertime, it kind of flips over, you've got this really, really cold ductwork because it's all, outside. And then whatever you've got inside is warm and probably at least a little bit moist. And so you open the PA cabinet and it's things can get real ugly. In our company, we treat our auxes the same as we do the mains. In fact, well, there's several reasons behind that, but one, I just don't want to mess with tubes anymore. I don't want to mess with all that duct work and all those issues. I don't want to mess with gassy tubes that you hit the button when you really need it and it goes bang. All of those kind of things. But the other thing that a lot of folks don't think about is the power consumption and the demand charges. You're floating along there and you've got this really nice solid state transmitter that's very efficient and all of that. And then you run the aux for, an hour to test it. And then the next electric bill comes in and you've got $1,000 surcharge on there for, because you shot the demand way up there. And I just don't want to worry about that. I don't want to think about it. So anyway, we're getting rid of, even today, I placed an order with Jeff Welton. I didn't see that he was on here, but he's probably pretty happy. Merry Christmas, Jeff, for a new GV transmitter to essentially upgrade a BE FM30 aux that's really not that old, but it's for those very reasons. So you got to take care of them. You got to turn them on. You got to keep them clean, and you got to take some extraordinary measures to keep the condensation and the critters out, and keep the tubes from getting gassy.
Yeah, having an auxiliary, if it does not come up, it's like a generator that doesn't come up. It's a waste of time and effort to have those things and say, yeah, I've got one, but you don't know that it's going to work. So that's part of the maintenance program, isn't it? Part of troubleshooting to make sure that you have all the equipment in proper order. Has anybody been in the situation I mentioned a minute ago where you were told you couldn't have an auxiliary because there was no space available as stations consolidated in location? Sometimes the old Continental isn't big enough to handle all the transmitters that get shoehorned in.
I haven't had that, but I'm constrained to point out how many companies are selling their tower sites. It's a good way to raise cash. And you go from the landlord, you go from this is your site and you can do what you want, put anything anywhere, to you're now renting some piece of the space that used to be yours. And I have had comments about, okay, you have a 2-drawer file cabinet. Yes. And said, that is not in the lease. I had one guy try to break a lease because when they changed owners, all the stuff in our building was not on the list. I said, well, that is true. But one thing that's in the building that is not on the list, and maybe of some interest to you, is the electronics for your strobes. And we have been housing it all these years for free. If you're going to be like that with the space, your strobe controllers don't have to be in our space anymore. And when we moved the site, we took our building with us and we left their steel box wrapped up in a new tarp on the slab. We told them, I sent them a FedEx. It was 6 weeks before our local site manager. Now, we were in a town called Iowa Park, but this was a call from a guy in Iowa. And he said, I can't believe you did that. I said, It's exactly what we told your boss's boss's boss we would do. We asked, what do you want to do? When, who should we meet? When can we meet them? And there was no response. We just said, it's time for us to go. So we went and we left their stuff. We did leave it powered up. And I'm thinking, I'm not an electrician, probably shouldn't have done it, but I didn't want the tower lights out.
Chris? You need to unmute yourself, sir. Mr. Hayes?
All righty. Sorry about that.
It's
I was
okay.
looking for something related to this. Chris actually hit upon the fact that backup stuff needs to be exercised regularly on a schedule. And even in big markets, I found that we'll do it another time because I'm busy today. And you don't want it coming up. Also, the discussion about transistors, I looked this up. Unfortunately, I can't find it on the web, but the May 2017 issue of Nuts and Bolts, this guy found a junked Regency transistor radio that was the very first transistor radio marketed for sale in the US. And he restored it. Amazingly, got it working again. 4 transistors. It used a 22.5 volt battery. Why, you ask? Well, we're talking about germanium transistors. Anybody remember point contact transistors? Way back, the CK722s and was it a 2N107? I don't remember. When the very first playing with transistors, those things were around. Anyway, it's an interesting article. If I can find it on the web, I'll try and forward a link to it. But I've got a PDF of it. I scanned it because I had the magazine. But it's really interesting. Interestingly, the next generation radio, the first thing they did was go to 6 transistors so there'd be some actual power in the audio, because with 4 transistors and 1 little class A point contact, it wasn't very loud. So just an interesting piece of history there. I also thought I would share quickly a story I was told by a guy who had been working one of the smaller markets as a chief years and years and years ago. Bam, a transmitter went off. Oh, geez, well, this tube has failed. He gets the spare tube off the shelf. Bam, oh, there's something really wrong with this transmitter. He's in there. And I guess it was on site because the jock kind of wandered in. And I said, I'm not an engineer, but I know because the FCC requires spares on the shelf, remember those days, that often the owners put the bad tubes on the shelf so the FCC inspector will see that there are tubes there. And sure enough, every tube on that shelf was a bad tube, and that's what the problem was. So fortunately, I don't think we run into that many tube rigs anymore, but you never know.
I've still got my no-tell button there, the one that says, watch out for no-tell.
Well, what's the deal?
Mark? Mr. Phillig? Hello?
Hello. Different topic
Yeah,
while we're talking
Yes, sir.
things.
I just saw Mr. Phillig's hand and then he went away. Harold?
Okay, let's see, make sure I'm unmuted. Yes. So, yeah, I remember my first transistor radio, and then the battery life wasn't very good. So I got a 6-volt lantern battery. It was a 9-volt radio, but I could run it on 6. So I taped it to a 6-volt lantern battery and it would run forever. On tower sites or any real estate in general, it is really surprising to me that it makes economic sense to sell something and then lease it back for something that you're going to use long term, whether that's a tower site or an office building or what. There are, of course, some tax advantages in that rent is deductible, whereas the principal payments on a loan are not. But it's still surprising to me, although with shared sites, somebody has to own it and then the other people rent. But I'm still surprised. If you own a site and sell it off, yeah, you intend to be there for 50 years. Why do that?
It's that last part. It's the 50 years. I don't think any of the bean counters are thinking 50 years. They think we're going to be out of here in 9 months. as soon as we find the bigger fool and get through the FCC. I mean, it's an astounding short-sightedness, and you're absolutely right. But I've wondered this about all the companies, and here's a dump truck full of cash, and you can say, look, we took on all this cash. I get a newsletter that rags on pretty much everything any of the large groups do, and they talk about these. If you sell your tower portfolio, it's closer to a loan because you're getting a large chunk of money and you are going to be paying it back if you stay long enough.
Yeah, it's not income, it's an asset trade, trading one
That
asset
is
for another.
that is exactly right.
And
But we've also had people, we've gone through cycles of that with our buildings. I remember when we owned the half dozen studio buildings across the country we were in, had a separate real estate company that managed those. I would get a paycheck that was partly broadcasting, partly other holdings, and partly the real estate company. But, tax guy comes through one day and says, we are selling our buildings. It's just better for us. I'm like, if you say so.
I was dealing with the, revising code to deal with the Unix Epic rollover in, 10 or 15 years or something. And my boss questioned doing that, saying, we'll be retired by then. Don't worry about it. So there's your short-term thinking.
And that's a sad thing, but there are some of these companies also where the GMs, just like the air staff to a degree, are angling to be promoted up to a larger market. And if you're in a small market, medium market, some of these guys think that they're going to make their mark by cutting expenses and then show the corporation that they're worthy of being brought up to the next level market. And I've seen many a station torn apart because of that. One of the aspects here, we talked about auxiliary transmitter. Single point of failure is where some of this is if you don't have an auxiliary. But most stations, there's more than one single point of failure, unfortunately. The antenna, coax, matching network if you're on an AM. Some stations only have one source of audio from the studio, even though most modern transmitters let you stick a little USB flash drive in the back and play music when everything else drops out, and you can be self-sufficient until the studio is recovered. But isn't it interesting how few stations really bother to have an auxiliary antenna or an auxiliary site? Again, bean counters? What do you think? Harold?
So we did work for a station in Los Angeles, a transmitter control system, and it was great because there was a spare antenna, a spare transmitter, and basically a spare radio station. So on the remote control, if it did a swap between transmitters, it brought up the auxiliary at 50% power and then dropped the main and then ran the auxiliary up to 100% and reversed the process going back. So nothing was ever off air there. So yeah, a spare radio station is good.
Problem is if you have it on the same tower, being fed by the same power, might as well just be one, because when one goes, they both go.
Yeah, I think they had separate power feeds, but yeah, they were on the same tower. So that's true. Another site would be good.
Your single point of failure could be the generator at that point, not so much. If you have two antennas on the same tower, they can be separate. And now, David, once I visited you down in Dallas, and you had a transmitter sitting in your studio building as an N+1, as I recall.
That's right. We did. N was relative because it was a tube transmitter. We were going to have a solid state, but we happened to have a tube transmitter. There was a station that was south of Dallas, upgraded and moved to a site quite a ways north of Dallas. We moved a dozen stations around, and sort of the overlap of the two transmitter sites was studio, and we did not buy new transmitters. We moved it one big Harris at a time, and I was just afraid if we drop one of these off the back of a truck, we're suddenly one transmitter that may be at the other place. And we stuck a 4-bay on the STL tower, and it was 50 feet above average terrain. It was about 150 feet above ground. We tested it late one night. It lit up Northwest Dallas. It would have been awful to be on it for any length of time, but way better than being off. Thing I've seen the large groups do in both Dallas and Houston, you want two of everything. And the thing we had was for our big Dallas FM, the biggest biller, its main transmitter was one of the American towers. Its first aux was a Richland tower about 5 miles away. And Richland had called and wanted us to move and said, we're not moving farther from town. They said, we have gotten everyone in town on here with we're going to sell you something. And I said, you make it cheap enough, we can do aux space. And then we had a third site, which was a 500-foot tower, used to be owned by an earlier owner of the station. So we had 3 transmitter sites off of 2 different power substations, 2 different phone exchanges, and 1 STL we could pick up at 2 sites. The third one, we ended up with an extra T1 that just picked up the audio and carried it the other place. It was, and 2 of the sites eventually had generators. It was very hard to do that. One of the big groups moved off of we were on the oldest American tower. One of the groups moved all their mains to the next tower over, which was also an American tower. And I asked, why are you moving? It was 100 feet taller. It had a newer panel antenna. But I asked, why are you moving? Said, well, the old antenna is falling apart. I said, it is, but they're obligated to replace it. And as the only station on it anymore, we can't burn it down by ourselves. They said, you're whatever we were paying, $6,000 a month, I think. Said, well, let's keep the old one for spare for $4,000 a month, but you need to take the one next door, the new main, for $8,000. I said, I'm paying $8,500. I'm paying $9,000 a month for 3 sites. They're wanting me to pay $12,000 for 2 that could fall on each other. If either collapsed, it would take, the guy wires were intertwined. They would both go, probably some of their neighbors. They were on the same generator, the same power substation, the same phone company facilities. I just thought, why is this a good idea? And several of the groups did exactly that. You can find 5 stations in one room in one tower and their mates in the other. And it's just one of those, I think they had so little staff, they needed them close together because they just couldn't, they wanted their parts close by and everything.
I think one of the stations I admired the most had about 10 different ways to feed the transmitter site. There's the program audio, there was an STL, there was Ethernet, there was RPU channels that were available. There was everything, and I guess right up to using the business 2-way channel if necessary. But they could get the audio from the studio to the transmitter, one of any of almost a dozen ways, and that could not be their source of failure. Their source of failure literally was the tower. And then there was the time when Tony at KFI was driving down to investigate an outage. And as he got closer and closer, he noticed the tower wasn't there. Somebody had flown a little plane into it and knocked it over.
Hey, Barry. Hello,
Yep.
Barry.
Mark?
Yeah, that's a bad feeling. When I worked in Houston for the big consolidator, we had an opportunity and the way we acquired a site, we could put a rack there. And at the time we had a spare BE 2K transmitter that was 1 rack. So we put it there with a 4-bay antenna. It was great. It was like the doomsday transmitter. We could remotely bring it up on any of our FM channels and had a separate audio feed for it. So at the studio, you just patched whichever station you needed to that transmitter. And that proved to be very handy several times because it was on a different, building than anybody else. It was on a different power. It didn't go out when other places did go out, just the way the power grid was set up there. The 2K isn't much, but it sure is better than nothing.
Well, yeah, and of course, you raise a very important point there, and that is if you look at the coverage contours of a 5 or a 50, or they don't change that much.
No, we certainly covered, 90% of our desired audience. The guys way out 30 miles out didn't hear it, but we didn't. That's not who buys ads.
Yeah,
And-
the
and
first
it-
kilowatt does a lot of the carrying. That last kilowatt is extraneous.
Some
Yep.
time ago, I another station, another guy driving into a power vault. It was they took down an RCA BT. It was a BTF10. So it took a week to go through because it smoked the whole diode stack, and eventually I came to the tube socket, and that had to be replaced. But the thing that was amazing is they had an old Gates BC1B out there, or something like that. Very funny looking tubes. And I finally got the exciter portion of it up onto the air. And the group chief was driving down from Phoenix. He got within about 40 miles or so of Tucson, heard the station, turned around, went home, figured I'd fixed it. It did take about a week to repair the main. But yeah, there 250 watts, 218 watts is what was going up the tower. And a lot of you guys have translators that for 10 watts or 20 watts will go 80 miles, depending upon where you have the tower.
Well, especially down where I am, the land is flat like a pancake. If you have 100 feet of elevation, even on your STL tower, you're 100 feet above average. So it does pretty good.
Yeah, quite so.
I think a lot of it is just see your place when it's working. I think my first chief's job, we had a RCA BTF20E blunderbuss of a transmitter, but it was pretty when all of the lights were working. Every button had 4 387s or whatever under it. And when I got it, it did not have all the lights and not everything worked. You'd have a problem and not know it because they didn't light up, but you don't think about it because you never saw it when it was working properly. Took over a station, had a 5 kilowatt CSI AM. And I noticed pretty quickly that on power change, there'd be a spark, or there'd be a light. You'd see a flash within the cabinet. It was very bright, like an electronic flash. Didn't hear a kabang or anything. It was just this flash. And I'm a long time before I jimmy the door and just look at it. Said, okay, I'm standing in back watching, have someone out front push it. And what had happened is it had somehow burned a hole in the side of an inductor. It didn't short to anything, and it didn't stop being an inductor. But there was this arc, and it didn't arc to anything, so it wasn't short, it wasn't going out. And what I should have realized some points that there is not a visible power change mode indicator inside the cabinet. I just, it's kind of, that was the rabbit. It just, something is not quite right, and I wasn't connecting it. Fortunately, I lived in a town with Peter Dahl, and next time I'm over, it's Gary, I need one of these. That's something I kind of miss is local parts houses. El Paso had 2 or 3 really good ones. If you needed to pester them late at night, you'd wake them, they'd meet you. You got what you needed, and then you also kind of got an armload of everything else because they had it, you'd cost them a night's sleep.
Mark, you mentioned, Brady, please, I see your hand.
The mute thing moved. Once again, David, I have to bounce off of something that you were talking about that's really, really important. Paying attention to unusual things that don't cause a problem. You've noticed that there's something that isn't quite right, seeing that flash. I was doing one of my loud and clean, week-long visits to, clean up the audio for an entire radio station from production room through the antenna. And I was at the transmitter site, and the local engineer switched to the backup transmitter. Well, the way that you switched to the backup transmitter there was you sat at a desk behind the transmitters and went into your PC and controlled the remote control remotely because it had a sequence of steps built into the remote control. But that meant that you couldn't be in front of the transmitter and watch what happens. Well, I was the visitor and I was standing in front of the transmitters. And when the antenna coax switch changed positions, the main transmitter, the way they did it was they turned the backup and the main on at the same time so that the transfer switch would momentarily break the interlocks while the switch moved, but nobody had ever watched it. Well, it turned out that whoever had installed that transmitter had not used the interlock. He had wired it so that when you were going to switch between transmitters, the sequence was to turn the transmitters off through their remote control functions. But when he was at the transmitter side, he would put the transmitter into local. So it wasn't responding to these things. And I'm standing in front of this transmitter, and instead of the power going to 0, what I saw was the power go to about 1/3 and the reflected power bouncing like crazy. And when it came back, there were 2 red lights on 2 modules in the transmitter. And they had been arguing with the manufacturer of the transmitter for a couple of years about the reliability problem in their RF amplifiers, and already made a deal to send that transmitter back for credit and replace it with another manufacturer's product, when all along it was whoever had installed that transmitter had not used the external fail-safe wiring that's intended for that antenna. And no one had noticed. I noticed it when I was there to do audio.
I have seen sites where they did tie them to the interlocks, and you have to be extremely careful with this. I think it's better to have a controller that's external to the switch. You want to get statuses from the switch, but don't run the interlocks through it, because whether it makes before it breaks or breaks before it makes, these are little moving contacts in micro switches. If nothing else, they're going to get dirty one day and stop conducting, and you'll switch modes and you'll be off until, or you'll find a jumper clip across where the switch was.
Yeah, several times I've built my own antenna controllers, because I like to have the antenna controllers provide a contact closure to the transmitter to turn it off, in addition to the set of contacts that are actually in the coax switch. That way I've got 2 different things making sure there's no power going there.
Yeah.
I burned up an antenna in the Washington, D.C. suburbs when I was much younger, and I didn't do anything. I was told to install a little piece of equipment that ran on the 24-volt DC power supply that supplied power to the whole site. And I was in the rack, and all I had done was connected another device to that 24 volts. But that somehow caused the transmitter and antenna controller to decide to change positions. And I'm there. And I didn't do anything except do what I was told, which was hook up this other load to this centralized 24-volt DC power supply. And all of a sudden, the room filled with smoke. And since then, I've got to have 2 things that are going to turn off transmitters before an antenna switch moves.
That's good. It's amazing how much abuse a piece of equipment can take day after day, maybe months or years, because someone did something. They did the best they could or the best they could figure, but it's there switching hot, or it's switching high to low wildly. And then you find things that, that's very cute. Then occasionally you'll find things where they're fragile as eggshells, where one little mistake and it's dead.
Yeah.
Is
The
that
mixer-
a Radio
mi-
Shack mixer in the middle of that?
I was going to say, that's a nice touch, the mixer in the middle of all.
It's one of several pictures that I've got around here.
Was that operating, or was this on the way out?
That was operating.
I was afraid you were going to say that.
That was operating. And that, let's see if I can tell you, it came. See, I don't know if the individual told me or allowed me to use the name of the state. Sometimes folks don't want to let us use the name of the station or their own name. This was discovered by a new engineer. Spent several months after that repairing and getting rid of all that stuff. According to the article on the BDR, one of the worst I've ever seen articles. And I know David's got a library of scary pictures.
Of very sad things. And I have a couple that looks like rat's nests like that. And when we took over Austin, the scariest thing we had is they had a very hands-on manager who was going to earn his bonus. He built a bunch of little voice room type studios, but he thought commercial sound foam must have been too expensive for his taste. And we found all of these layers of yellow foam from a Kmart, from a Walmart. And we thought, okay, pal, you have, we make fun of our risk managers right and left. We were, we had never, the big whiteboard never said, go out and do some damage. It never said today, let's hurt someone. But we drew the line at things that would burn and cause horrible fumes and kill you on the way out. Just an astonishing mess. But there were also, we found something, a piece of lumber a little bigger than a yardstick, a little thicker. It had a relay tie wrapped to it. And he was interrupting, and this was probably not him. This was one of his actual chief types, but they were interrupting AC on an ice cube relay, tie wrapped to this block of wood that looked like a thick yardstick. And just just leaning against the wall. It's like, okay, yeah, that's going to have to come out pretty quickly. There was no air conditioning back in this rack space. There were 2 racks from floor to ceiling. There was not a single missing space. And when we started moving things, it was hard to get things out.
I think it was Mark that started the thought of starting with the transmitter and working your way back. I think that's who brought that up, or was it Chris? And I remember, don't want to dwell too much on horror stories we could do that. Maybe the last week of the month we can do horror stories, or the worst manager I've ever worked for, or the worst station, or something like that. But what I wanted to talk about again was troubleshooting, and another real life experience. One of the stations in this cluster had a hum under it. It had been there for 5 years. And I knew that because I had listened to that station from time to time. And so one of the things that I was determined to do when I got hired on there was to see if I could find out what happened. And I was looking for the picture, which I have again somewhere, but can't find it. Well, I traced my way back from the transmitter site. That's disconnected the program line, and there was no hum. And worked my way back through all the equipment out there, went back to the studio, and I walked around, and there was a ground rod driven right through the floor of the studio, but nothing was hooked to it. So I went back to the audio processor, which was in a, ready for this, wooden rack, and I used some alligator clips. And for the first time in 5 years, the station was silent when nothing was on. Now, the moral of the story, yeah, just like was mentioned, you start at one end and work your way back to the other step by step. Know what your system is and have your mind tuned to what should be and what wasn't. Grady?
Barry, you make a very good point, and you even underscore the philosophy that I learned from Syncor Electronics. Y'all remember Syncor? I'm
yeah.
really sorry they went out of business because they made really good test gear, primarily for, TV repair shop kind of things. But they made really good stuff, and they had a diagnostic philosophy, which was take the system, break it in half in the middle and test the two ends. Now you've eliminated half of your system because you find that one end works and the other end doesn't. Then you break that one in half. And when you've got a problem like a buzz, that's the best way to find it. And Barry went to the middle, disconnected the studio to transmitter link, and the buzz went away. Now he knew that it was nothing at the transmitter site, splitting that system in the middle. I love that philosophy.
By the way, there still is a Sencor. Mostly video test here, but they're still out there. Mr. Mackey. John?
Oh, yeah, I'll go ahead and I have a hum and buzz story that turned into an audio silence alert gone astray story. I had a hum on one of our FMs, and I had done a little bit of piddling around, but put off the task of diving deeply into it, which was foolish of me. Some days later, there was an automation goof up, and that station and the music stopped playing. There was enough hum. I had the audio silence alert the audio input set sensitive enough that it picked up the hum and did not respond to the silence. So it just, and yes, I agree that I split it up to determine whether the problem was at the studio or at the transmitter. And it turned out that the problem was I had a bad jumper in a STL transmitter at the studio. Replace that, the hum went away.
That's all it takes, doesn't it? Harold?
Yeah, so your split in the middle, of course, is a standard binary search algorithm used all the time. And the silent sense thing is interesting. If there's an AGC after the hum, it'll bring that hum right up to 100% modulation or so. I had a problem with the SMC carousels. The head preamp would break into oscillation, and it'd be ultrasonic, but it would be enough to hold up the silent sense. So there'd be silence all night long, overnight.
Yeah, I've seen stations that were silent anywhere from an hour to 5 days.
And of course, the other thing on the automation is getting a flip in the tape, so the 25 hertz on the left channel ends up on the right channel and gets missed. So you have muffled audio for an hour and then nothing.
Yeah. Or remember the old spotters, Schaefer spotters that would miss the number of windows, and you would have all these little pieces of tape on the floor when you came in the next day. I'll raise another issue here. Maybe somebody will like to talk about this. Another station that I've had my share of fun installations and fun people that didn't have a clue what they were doing. I remember working on a spot master cart machine and trying to figure out why it didn't work right, and found a complete cigarette inside of it. And MPEX 351 had a head gap that I could put my fingernail through, and they wondered why that was muffled. I went to work for a station with a non-directional tower that measured 73 ohms. And this was off of a 302 coming from a rather well-known consulting engineer company. And all I can tell you is that a pair of alligator clips brought it down from 72 to 63 ohms. We went from there. It's amazing what's out there. Was it Grady, you were talking about a transmitter leaning against the wall? I've seen those. Kevin Kidd told us once about a transmitter sitting out in the middle of a field with a tarp over it because the owner of the land had died, and his son knocked down the barn that this was in and threw a tarp over it. And the weird part was nobody in the station knew where the transmitter was. They didn't even know what a transmitter was, if you really get right down to it. So when they called Kevin, he had to call the sheriff's office to find out where the transmitter was.
What do you do if you want to trace coaxes underground? You have no clue where they are. And I'm thinking AM where you also have a ground system. What do you use to trace these?
Cable locator like the phone company uses if you can get it. Clamp one end, there's a thing that clamps an inductor around one end, and then a sniffer that you put on the ground and follow it. Looks great.
Is it wireless or is there a connection between the two ends? You drag a long cord?
So it's just the sniffer is battery powered. It looks a little bit like a metal locator. It's the same basic kind of format, except it has an inductive pickup on the end that's tuned to the frequency that the transmit end is transmitting on.
I borrowed a gizmo from 3M. It was very big, looked like a death ray, and you just held it like you'd hold a shovel. And it was great for finding the ground screen. I couldn't definitively find the coaxes. I had a problem where the TDR says on 3 lines, we had a fault at about 70 feet. I thought this is just getting past the parking lot. But this happened decades ago. You know, they've apparently been broken all this time, but they added a coax for a translator, and the ditch where it is, I'm thinking you broke it when you installed the translator, but there's no scar in the yard. The weeds and the grass are, haven't been moved in ages.
By the way, you start talking about ground systems. You need to make sure you have a ground system. Copper prices are up again right now after being down for a while. But there's another thing that you have to watch out for, and that is a station where they had their transmitter site so overgrown with weeds and plants and trees and things that they hired a landscaper to come in and how shall I say this gently, scrape the land, except he scraped it enough that he pulled the whole ground system out.
I thought you were going to say ran a tiller across it.
Yep. So you want to make sure that as you do that maintenance, as you check your ground system, you check your base impedance. Yeah, you want to make sure your ground system's still there. Harold?
Yeah, a couple of things. We're doing some work in our yard here, and utility companies, of course, will locate their stuff up to your meter. They won't locate your stuff. There are underground locating companies, and so I use them to locate stuff beyond the utility meter. But also I've got a KOLSOL, KOLSOL FO2 Pro underground wire locator. I bought it when I was trying to find some problems with AC wiring in a house in Colorado, but I managed to find the problem before the locator showed up. So never got a chance to try it, but it does operate the same. What was that again?
Say that again, please. Who made it?
KOLSOL, and I've got the FO2 Pro underground wire locator. And it does look like it operates the same way that the utility company thing is. They actually drove a ground stake, and then attached something to the water pipe or the wire running along the gas pipe or whatever to follow it above ground.
Yeah, there are 2 sites up in Lubbock that if we could find the cables without running up, without having to dig it out with a gardening spade. One of them's one of them broke a feed line and a sample line for a different tower, which really makes setting networks difficult. And someone decided, well, it's very low power. We'll just instead of 50 ohm larger coax, we'll put in 75 ohm cable TV coax.
If you Google cable locator, you get quite a few things showing up. Some of them are quite pricey. I also see where you can rent them, which might be a way around that.
That would be cool. Yeah,
Interesting.
you have a site that was wired in, I think, 62 ohm coax in the 50s, replaced with 50 ohm coax in the 70s. But it sits on about 30 acres of land. There is not one picture, there are no notes, there are no measurements to anything. And you kind of work on the assumption that, okay, it was straight from some point at the building to, let's say, the near tower, and then, to more distant towers, but you don't know that.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you know where that exits the building, though, you have a start with one of these inductive locators.
And
I
not just
missed,
go ahead.
I missed something. Somebody just a statement or two back said they were using 75 ohm coax for what?
Feeding an AM antenna tuning unit.
How much power was that expected to carry?
Couple 100 watts.
The
And
original
it
It's
might.
It's
it might.
It's non-standard, but it's big enough. And being an AM, you'll reach in the network at the phaser leaving and the antenna tuning unit at the other end. And, the power doesn't particularly care the impedance in between. It's just 50 ohm coax wasn't that expensive. And someone thought, we'll do it in the 75. There is a site near me that has 3 towers. They ran 9 runs of the aluminum jacketed cable TV stuff, about 68 or 69. They rebuilt this system. Each tower gets a day line, a night line, and a spare. And they use the same stuff for the sample system. So each tower actually had 5 of these coaxes, and non-standard. And it took them about a year to tune it up and proof it, but it seems to work fine.
Well, another thing that you want to make sure, and we're starting to have some attrition here as people have to go back and close down for the day, and we can come back and have more sessions like this if folks like it and want us to do so. But as maybe a parting shot for the moment, if you have a ground system, you likely have a tower, and you likely have a fence around that tower, or maybe you do, and there's a gate on that fence, and there's a lock on that gate. Maybe not. Don't know if that's a secure gate. Here's one. The gate's held closed by the tumbleweeds, and here's one where the gate really isn't much of a gate, sort of like our southern border at the moment, but let's not even go there. And then my favorite picture of this bunch is this lock. Yes, those are tie wraps holding the gate lock chain. And these are the things you run into. And some of them, again, you find out when the station's off the air and you have to troubleshoot that. But the whole package of maintaining a station requires attention to the building, the grounds. I was just called into a station this past week where they had no air conditioning. Yeah, okay, it's Tucson, and so it's not snow like it is in many of your places, but it's much like Texas in this time of the year. But you walk in the door and there is half an inch or more ice on the front of the air conditioner, which is going, "Rrr, rrr, rrr." And, again, these people, somebody's got to check their equipment from time to time, Grady.
I found one this morning, Barry. May I share a screen?
Sure. Go right ahead. Then Grady's up.
See if I can find it. I'm looking for a match.
Grady, give Grady a shot here, and
yeah.
he'll talk while you're finding it.
I was reacting to those great pictures that you showed of the chain link gates and various ways of securing them. I have a site that I've been the engineer there for something like 20 years through 3 different tower owners for the site. My client is just a tenant there. And for the first 2 owners, I kept telling them that the hinge on the gate was only at the top, but it was one of those little hemispherical things that sits in a cup, and the bottom wasn't actually attached at the bottom to keep it secure. You could just walk over to where the hinge was, lift the gate, and walk in. When the new owner came in, they changed the padlocks, cut my padlock out of the link, and I couldn't get in there. Thank goodness nobody had ever repaired it. I spent 6 months going in and out by lifting the gate off the hinge cup.
All right. David?
Haven't found it.
Okay. Harold, I think I saw your hand.
Yeah, on air conditioning freezing up, I had that happen at a station in Colorado. I was sent out to swap out the air conditioner, and really it was just that the inside had been coated with ice. So cleaning it up and turning it down a little bit so that it didn't pump quite so cold helped. The site had overheated because of ice in the air conditioner.
I read across yesterday or the day before an email that Mike Burrell sent to me some years ago from Tennessee. He was doing an audit on his station, and was it Chris that mentioned the usage, peak usage problems that stations would run into, and he found that they were just astronomical power bills, and he found out that it was because the air conditioners were set too close to each other, that they would often come on together and run the thing well past peak. And he set them off, 5, 8 degrees, maybe 10, and the electric bill dropped dramatically.